Okay, so good morning, Dr. McDougall.
Good morning. How are you today?
Good, good. How are you?
Well, thank you for inviting me to be on your show. Well, we're talking to people in what part of the world?
This is St. John's, Newfoundland in Canada.
In Canada, okay. All right.
Yeah, we're like the Alaska. We're very similar to Alaska, except we're on the East Coast.
Oh, well, that's nice. Do you have a good following of people interested in food?
What is that?
Do you have a good following of people interested in food?
Yes. Yes.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, what would you like to talk about this morning?
Yeah. Well, first I want to give a brief introduction to some of my viewers who may not know you. So I'd just like to start off with, you grew up in the Midwest in the States, and I did as well. I actually grew up in Chicago, and you ate the standard American diet. And can you tell people what that diet was like and how it affected your health growing up?
Oh, yeah. Well, my parents, they were out of the Depression, and they lived during the Depression times. And my mother promised that she'd never have her children have to eat what she ate during the Depression, which was pretty simple food, potatoes and squash and, not much. And so she made sure that her children had plenty of protein and calcium. So I would start out in the morning with eggs for breakfast. And admittedly, I had a substantial number of eggs for breakfast. I'd gone for lunch for the ring bologna sandwiches, and for dinner would be always things like burgers or chicken or pizza. In fact, I was a big pizza fan. And as a young boy, I suffered from abdominal pains, stomach pains, and severe constipation problems that I would hate to even tell you about, except that if I did, most of you could relate to what I'm saying. At 7 years old, I lost my tonsils due to consumption of dairy products. And as a teenager, I didn't have much endurance. And so when I was out on the playground, I was a bit slow, which, I didn't understand. I had the usual oily skin and acne. And then a life-changing event occurred, which I still live with today, 54 years later. At 18 years old, I had a massive stroke. It paralyzed the left side of my body, and as I say, till today, I walk with a limp because of that. At 24, the abdominal pains became so bad that they put me through major abdominal surgery. And I think I would have been probably dead, or at least had to have heart surgery by the time I was 30. Now, you may think my story is unusual, but it's not. Maybe I was ahead a decade or two of most people living in the Western diet, but 1,000 teenagers a year have strokes or heart attacks. So I was in very poor health. Fortunately, in the process of becoming a medical doctor, I became very frustrated. And then I had an experience that changed my life forever. I trained in Michigan, met my wife, Mary, in Michigan. We've been together, it would be 46 years now. And in 1972, we moved to Hawaii. In 1973, I got a job as a sugar plantation doctor on the big island of Hawaii. And that's where my life really changed. My own personal diet really started to change. I was taking care of first, second, third, and fourth generation Filipinos, Japanese, Chinese, and Koreans. These are men and women that worked on the sugar plantation. And they had come from, the first generation had come from their native lands of the Philippines, Korea, China, etc. And the diet they had learned as children, they kept, first generation. The second generation, the ones that were born on the big island of Hawaii, they were influenced more by the Western diet. It was Texas Drive-In when I first went there, the home of the malasada, it was called. And then in about 1974, the first McDonald's came to Hilo, Hawaii. And I was one of their first and best customers. But what I had noticed during my 3 years as a sugar plantation doctor, where I tried to help 5,000 sugar plantation workers, What I found out was that I was a terrible doctor. My patients did not get well, no matter how many drugs I pushed at them. But now we're talking about the usual patient, the everyday common problems of chronic disease, people who had high blood pressure, diabetes, arthritis, heart disease, cancers, and so on. No matter how hard I tried, they wouldn't get better. So I became very frustrated as a physician during those 3 years as a plantation doctor. But I also became enlightened. What I saw was it was not inevitable to become sick as you got older. What I saw was my first generation patients lived into their 80s and 90s, fully functional. This was typical. Whereas the second generation got fatter and sicker. And by the time you got to the third generation, fully Americanized, you found some of the fattest, sickest people in the world, the people who lived in Hawaii, that I was taking care of as a sugar plantation doctor. So from that observation, I knew the diet must have something to do with disease, because that's the only thing that changed during the passing of generations. They had the same genetics. They did the same kind of work on the plantation, the sugar plantation, for 100 years. But they had changed their diet just over about 35 years. And as a result, they have some of the highest rates of cancer in Hawaii in the world. And gout is very common among the Filipinos. And, you know, it became obvious that there was something that was very important that changed during those 3 generations or 4 generations. Well, after being a plantation doctor for 3 years, Mary and I spent 3 years on the sugar plantations on the Big Island of Hawaii. After spending 3 years as a sugar plantation doctor, I decided to go back and learn how to be a really good doctor. So I went back into a training program in Honolulu, which was a very high quality program. It was a residency to learn how to be an internal medicine specialist. So I spent the next 2.5 years becoming an internal medicine specialist, hoping that I would get the tools to help my patients who had chronic disease. But what I found out was my professors were doing no better than I was. People with chronic disease, they just never got better. It didn't matter how many pills you threw at them. With acute problems like lacerations, broken bones, infections, the medical business does a lot of good. But when it comes to chronic illnesses, unfortunately, you know, just the word chronic should tell you that we're not doing a very good job. Mm-hmm. So then my journey took me to the medical library, to the scientific research. And what I found out is that many people had observed that when people become rich, I mean, this is over the last 4,000 or 5,000 years it's been documented, that when people become rich, say in what is now known as Egypt, when they became pharaohs and queens, and priests and priestesses, they became sick. And when you dig these people up or take them out of their pyramids and you do CAT scans on their autopsies, you find that these wealthy people, the mummies, had terrible atherosclerosis. They had obesity, they had problems of, even problems with their children that are related to diet, to their offspring. So it was obvious that the food, which was different for the kings and queens of 4,000 years ago, just like the kings and queens of 400 years ago, is that they ate a large amount of animal food. Whereas the common person who built the pyramids, the people who worked the fields, they lived on a diet of starch. And you know, I traced that through many generations, and I started reading scientific studies that were done beginning 100 years ago. And the scientific studies clearly showed what the human being is supposed to eat. But we could have figured that out just by looking at history, geography. Many of your listeners are old enough to remember when most of the world ate a starch-based diet. That's all changed in the last 35 years. It used to be that, well, I'll give you the dates before 1985, In China, 90% of their diet came from rice. It was white rice, admittedly, but 2 billion people were living on 90% of their diet is rice. Now the Chinese are some of the fattest, sickest people in the world. They have a population where they brag that 12% are frankly diabetic and half are pre-diabetic. Whereas prior to 1985, before the Chinese in China became wealthy, they had virtually no obesity, no type 2 diabetes. They had no multiple sclerosis. They had no heart disease, no prostate cancer, no breast cancer, no colon cancer, and so on. When I say no, there were some rare exceptions. Well, anyway, the scientific research was done for the purpose of discovering facts, truths about people, about human nutrition. This was all done by people motivated by gaining good information, not necessarily by money. And then about 1985, that all changed. The drug companies, the hospital businesses, back then, back in 1985 and before, as a doctor, you really weren't allowed to even advertise in the United States. But of course, all that's changed. Your doctors are advertising to you to sell you heart surgery and facelifts and all kinds of things. So anyway, doctors advertise and hospitals advertise. In fact, what's turned out is that in the last 35 years, the medical business has been the only growing financial segment of the U.S. economy. Money borrowed from China, by the way. So it's become a huge business medicine has. And as a result, money corrupts. It's just plain simple human nature, is that even though we have success and the truth on our side, they have all the money. The drug companies, the food companies, device companies, the hospitals, the doctors, and so on. They make money by taking care of sick people, not by getting sick people well, but just administering treatment. So I became very disenchanted with the medical business because I saw that none of my patients were getting better who had chronic illnesses. And so I launched a passion of mine, which was to read the scientific literature. And I started that about 1976. Changed my own diet about 1977. Became a board certified internist. I'm now a clinical professor at 4 universities. I'm licensed in 4 states to practice in the US. We published several scientific papers, which you can get through open access, which show clearly, which confirm what thousands of publications had shown us before industry took over the medical journals, before industry took over the doctors. I mean, a big topic today is the opioid crisis caused by medical doctors.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Medical doctors are people just like your friends and neighbors. They're just people, and they're motivated by the same things, principally money and ego. And as a result, we have a medical system that does not address the cause of illness or the cure of illness, only the treatment of the symptoms of illness when it comes to chronic disease. And out of that fact comes the observation, which is consistent, that heart surgery doesn't work for chronic coronary artery disease. Yet it's a $100 billion a year business in the United States. The fact that type 2 diabetics are 100% curable with diet. And instead, my profession treats them with a whole variety of drugs, which in their own sake, the drugs cause serious adverse effects. But of course, as I said, they have all the money, so they can skew their advertisements. They own the medical journals, they buy the researchers, and it's all corrupt. Basically, one of the things our current administration has done for me is to teach me that people are enchanted by fake news.
Mm-hmm.
And it's okay to present alternative facts. It's okay to lie. And I never knew that. I always thought that that was one of the worst things you could do, is to lie. But, you know, the whole system is involved in a whole bunch of lies that have caused terrible tragedies. But your listeners don't have to put up with this, because we know what causes 80–90% of the illnesses in Western societies. And that's from eating like a king and a queen.
And now I think it's been recognized by the World Health Organization, hasn't it? Most of the chronic degenerative diseases, they say, are due to diet and lifestyle.
Yeah, you know, the Heart Association, Cancer Society, the World Health Organization, and so on, they kind of dip into the issues of diet.
Mm-hmm.
Like the World Health Organization has told us that overnutrition causes more problems than undernutrition has for the last 20 years. Likewise, the Heart Association tells us that we should eat a low-fat diet. And the Cancer Society came out in 2015 and made the professional statement that doctors should treat people with cancer with a plant food-based diet. That's from the American Cancer Society. They don't quite know what to do, but they know that in the studies done, people who have cancer, like prostate, breast, colon cancer, melanomas, this was published in February of 2015. The American Cancer Society's official position on part of the basic fundamental treatment of a cancer patient is a good diet. But, you know, that has never transferred into any changes in practice. You watch CNN News or, you know, 60 Minutes or whatever, what you find is they're sponsored by the drug industries. And, you know, these medications, they have some effects. But the overall effects when it comes to chronic disease are, you know, with few exceptions, more harm is done than good. Now let's talk about the good news. You can get well. If you realize that you suffer from diseases of kings and queens, you just look in the mirror. 80% of people in the United States and Canada are overweight.
Well,
and about 40% are obese.
Yeah, and in Newfoundland, we actually have the worst rates of chronic diseases, and the same for being overweight and obese, including childhood obesity.
You do up in your town?
Yeah, so Newfoundland is it's an island, and the province is Newfoundland and Labrador. And Labrador is part of the mainland. It's attached to Quebec, just further up north.
Right, I got an idea where you live.
Yeah. But yeah, we've got pretty bad rates of chronic degenerative diseases. And so there's a question that I would like to ask, and it's for my viewers, and it's just to get a sense of, you know, what are chronic degenerative diseases? And, you know, a lot of people think it's just an inevitable part of aging, that living longer, and this should be expected. And, you know, they have a family history, so they say, well, I'm just going to have to take drugs, and adding a bit of weight on, that's just part of, you know, getting older as well.
Well, you know, the fact is we do get older and we do die.
Yes.
But chronic diseases, I think separate them into a couple of categories that will make it easier for your listeners to understand. There are acute illnesses, which the medical profession does a great job with. For example, if you get in an auto accident or you get burnt, or, you know, we're really good at patching people up, but that's from a single injury, you know, like, you know, a crushing of the bone or an attack of bacteria. These are single injuries to the body. Those are acute illnesses, and doctors can intervene and tip the balance in favor of the patient. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this is very important, but only represents maybe 10–20% of the problems that doctors see. The other 80% of problems are due to not single injuries, but repeated injuries. And that's how you get chronic disease. For example, if you repeatedly inhale 20 cigarettes a day or 40 cigarettes a day, then you develop a chronic cough and chronic bronchitis due to repeated injuries. If you just smoke one cigarette, maybe once a month, you wouldn't develop this problem. So it's the same thing with the other chronic diseases we have, but the injuring agent there is the food. And when you eat like a king and a queen, I'll repeat for you, you end up looking like a king and a queen. And most of the people, in fact, one of the statements I'd like your listeners to memorize, because it's an argument that you can use against all of the low carbers, the high meat people, all the crazy people out there in the world recommending one diet or another. And that is the observation. If you're a historian, if you're involved in theology, if you have been able to observe geographic differences in people's appearance and their health worldwide, you'll come to the conclusion that all large, successful populations of people throughout all verifiable human history have lived on a diet where the bulk of the calories have come from starch. Now, starch is plant parts. Starches are plant parts. They can be above ground or they can be below ground, where a carbohydrate is stored for the plant use. If they're underground starches, they'd be thought of as root vegetables like potatoes and sweet potatoes and bulbs and corns. Above ground storage organs, starch, which the plant makes for itself, so it can regerminate, it can become anew when winter's over. The starch is stored above ground in grains and legumes. These are above ground storage organs. So if you look around the world throughout history, what you find is the bulk of people who've lived on planet Earth have lived on starch-based diets. Let's start with Asia. Typically when you think of people from Korea, China, Vietnam, Japan, etc., you think of people who are rice eaters primarily. They, of course, there are other starches that populations in Asia have lived on, but it's always been starches. If you take a look at the people in Central America, what you find is that for 1,300 years, the Aztecs and Mayans had civilizations which were based on corn. These were known as the people of the corn. They fought battles. They had athletic events. They bore children. They survived a tremendous hardship, living on corn and a few vegetables and very, very little animal food. We could talk about South America, the Incas living on potatoes and quinoa. Wherever you look in the world, you find that almost everybody, before they became rich, there were a few kings and queens and pharaohs and priests and priestesses along the way. But most of the people couldn't afford to eat all the animal foods and all the other delicacies. If you just take and stop and realize what you already know to be true, either from your history lessons or your observations because you're a traveler, or your observations because you watch documentaries, or you're a religious person and you read the Bible or the Quran, or you come to the conclusion that people have lived on starch-based diets: rice, corn, potatoes, sweet potatoes, beans, and so on. The exceptions are a few populations that live at the extremes of the environment. And you're talking about 60,000 people in the Inuit Eskimos up near where you live.
Yeah.
Inuit populations, I imagine, up in their area. And these people, they would burn 4,000 to 7,000 calories a day. They couldn't live on the diet that I recommend. They wouldn't have enough time in the day. But the environment, the cold environment up there has allowed the Inuit Eskimo to survive on a diet which is basically the Atkins diet. It's for 7 months of the year, their diet is based on animal products.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for 3 months of the year, or 3 to 5 months of the year, they had a little vegetable food. But otherwise, it was. But they didn't do well. The Inuit Eskimo has terrible atherosclerosis.
Yeah, that was
osteoporosis than the average American.
Mm-hmm.
Lifespan is, we're talking about the traditional Inuit Eskimo.
Yeah.
And I use the word Eskimo, I know offends some people, but history and scientific literature refers to these populations of people as Eskimos. That was before they became civilized, so to speak, Americanized. And now the typical person living in these regions, the native people in these regions, they go fishing with the green lure.
Mm-hmm.
To go fishing with a green lure means you drive through the fast food line, you roll down the window, and you hand a green lure out, and the person behind the counter hands you a fish burger.
Mm-hmm.
That's your, that's it. And they're some of the sickest people in the world. I know a lot about the Alaskans. I realize that's on the other side of the continent from you, and I may not be speaking as accurately as you can confirm or put me in the proper perspective.
Well, it's quite similar here. People who grew up and had their families grow up in Newfoundland, they have families that came over for the cod fishing, and they have a history of being able to survive the cold, harsh climate. Because we can have winter from November till May or the start of June. Pretty cold and the short growing season. And what people grew up on not that long ago was salted fish, usually cod, salted meat, salt pork, wild game, which is moose, caribou, tur, seals, berries, root vegetables. They would grow themselves, a lot of cabbage and potatoes and carrots and beets and that sort of thing. And then in addition, they'd have flour, usually white flour, and sugar and margarine. And that's what people grew up on and what they were used to. And then if you go further up north into Labrador, the diet's more like what you're talking about for the typical Eskimo diet. So today there's this push to return to the traditional ways of eating because of our healthcare crisis. And people are, saying they're struggling with their weight, they're on a lot of medications, they don't know what to do, and they want to return to real food, to a lifestyle that's a bit more active. So you would talk a bit about how Eskimos do so well, and I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the Eskimo Paradox and about similar populations around the world where people tend to easily become overweight and obese when they Westernize their diet.
Well, if the people from Newfoundland who their grandfathers, grandmothers, and certainly their great-grandfathers and grandmothers, if they were going to eat from the land, they would also have to live the same kind of lifestyle. In other words, they'd have to live in igloos. They'd have to go out on hunting expeditions. I mean, that was a very tough life. Extremely cold climate. Whereas today, the people in that region of the world have been, again, westernized. And they run around in heated SUVs and heated homes. And again, I'll go back to the population that I do know, which is the people who live in Alaska. They have some of the worst tooth decay, obesity. We're talking about half the population having type 2 diabetes. They're just terribly sick. And this goes through not just the native populations in Newfoundland and Alaska, but the Native American populations who used to live on corn. Like, for example, the Pima Indians in Arizona, 60% of them have gallbladder disease. About 60% have diabetes. Obesity is rampant, not just being overweight. And these Pima Indians are from a a lineage where, people originally grew up on a corn-based diet. And about 300 years ago, they split off. One group went to Arizona, another group went to Northwest Mexico, to Carper Canyon. And so we have the same genes. They're an interesting population of people to study. We have the same genes, but we have a different environment. The population that went to the reservations, they were put on U.S. reservations so they could steal their land. The populations that went on the reservations and were taken care of by the good old American government and become very, very sick. Whereas the Tahamari Indians, they're called, the Tahamari people who live in Copper Canyon, they have a very tough life now because of the drug cartel. But up until recently, they were some of the healthiest people on the planet. They're known as the running Indians. They run for 12 hours a day. They have cholesterol levels typically below 130 milligrams per deciliter. To translate that into Canadian units, you divide by 38. You get international units. They had no heart disease, no diabetes. And still, they've maintained their native diet for the most part. The people who live in the Copper Canyon, who are known as the Tahamari Indians, and they maintain a diet of corn and squash and beans, and they're basically immune from the Western diseases. Like I say, it's a tough life down there now because Copper Canyon is a great place for drug dealers to hide. And they brought the crime, a terrible amount of crime to these people. But here you have a perfect example of the same genes, which come from these populations, one going to Arizona, and they being the Pima Indians and getting among the fattest and sickest people in the world. And another segment of the same genes going to Northwest Mexico, to the Copper Canyon, and maintaining their native diet of corn, squash, and beans, who have virtually none of the diseases of the Western civilization. But there are many, many examples you can find of the same thing over and over again. But my point being is you're going to run into all kinds of people who have the truth. They will tell you that you need to eat an all-meat diet or a gluten-free diet, which is a whole other stuff you can get into, or a diet that's absent. The most popular diet is by a guy named, I think, Grundy is his name. It's a diet without lectins, which are plant food parts. And all kinds of crazy things people have talked about. But if you just step back and realize that I used to say 10 billion people have walked planet Earth. I was corrected by a professor at a university who told me 100 billion people have walked this Earth. I mean, 99.99% of the people who walk this Earth have consumed a starch-based diet. Now, it's really important that your listeners hear the word starch. Otherwise, they're going to fail. If they try and live on broccoli and cauliflower and lettuce and kale and so on, they're going to starve to death. And a lot of people are trying to do that with the idea that they want to get a nutrient-dense diet. Well, good grief, there are enough nutrients in white rice to almost win World War II. The Japanese almost won World War II living on a diet of over 90% white rice. And the people from Vietnam, they won against the Americans the Vietnamese conflict on a diet that was over 90% rice, white rice. So it's never a nutritional deficiency problem. There have been in the past problems of refined grains leading to beriberi and scurvy and so on, but not in this day and age. So you can prove it to yourself. You can look at the Bible, you can see that Genesis talks about the original diet of man being a plant-based diet. You can read the first chapter of Daniel, and Daniel publishes the first controlled trial of diet when his men came to a new kingdom, where they were serving lots of rich food. And Daniel asked the gatekeeper, can I keep my men on pulses and water, which are starches and water? And in the first chapter of Daniel, you'll see declared that his men, Daniel's men, who stayed on the pulses and water, at the end of 10 days, were much healthier, much stronger, better looking than those who ate the royal food diet, the king's diet. So again, the observations that you can make based upon religion, history, geography, common sense, the anatomy, the physiology of the human being, clearly says that we are a starch-eating population, people.
I have to say, from my own personal experience, I grew up in Chicago, and I had kind of a similar experience with food as you did. I had my tonsils removed when I was 8 years old. They were always swollen, so my ears were getting infected, and I felt lethargic and thought I had too much weight on, and I was just a little kid. And I was wondering, what's the difference? And I noticed other kids around me and how they would snack on an apple instead of ice cream or chips, and how they would look different and look healthier. And a good friend of mine became vegetarian after reading Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. And that was, before I was 10 or 12. And just from looking at that, I thought to myself, I'm supposed to eat fruits and vegetables. And I didn't know how to go about it. So, I ended up going, my mom would take us to the bookstore where we could spend like our allowance. And I'd go to the bargain book section, and I started looking at books that would talk about fruits and vegetables, and they told you all these benefits and stuff. So I became vegetarian, and then kind of struggled along trying to figure it out. But what I did find that made sense when I actually listened to some of your talks as well, it matched my experience. That if I didn't have starches, I was thinking about food all the time. I felt very, food insecure because I wanted to eat well, but if I didn't have those starches, then I was always hungry and I didn't have the right kind of energy. And because I wanted to be free of medications, to travel without having issues, and I didn't have a lot of money, I wanted to make it sustainable and to be able to do it anywhere. So for me, it just came from watching people and then from eating the food and feeling it. And so I have to say, since I eat the way that you recommend with the starch-based diet, there's no vegetable oils. I don't get hungry. I just know when my energy's low, and I don't have any food cravings. And I think it's just incredible the way that it works.
Well, anybody can, you need to have your eyes open, first of all. And of course, you have your own history of how your eyes were opened. And I could tell you, an hour-long story, and you can read about it in some of the books that I've written, about how my eyes were opened. Or you can go to my 2013 newsletters. You can learn about my mentors, people like Dennis Burkett and Nathan Pritikin and Walter Kempner and Roy Swank. These are men, and they happen to all be men, who pioneered the kind of treatment that I use in taking care of my patients have for the last 40 years. I've been doing this for 40 years. And, anybody who is frustrated because they can't find a diet that's satisfying, they can't find a diet that gives them the health they want, that will fill them up and keep their weight trim, it take you, well, probably 7 days to figure out what the truth is. I've run for, it's been almost 32 years. I've run residential programs. I've taken care of personally. I've been the physician. I don't do that anymore, but I was a physician. I've taken care of over 6,000 people. And we run a 10-day live-in program, a residential program, where we give a phenomenal education to folks. They stay with us in Santa Rosa, California, and we take them off their medications in most cases. In fact, you can read our published research, and it's never been criticized. It's open access. You just have to look up my name, McDougall John, and diet, and you'll find the various papers that I've written. But one in particular was written about our patients, 10 years of patient data, which was 1,615 people, nobody excluded, who went through the 10-day program, and the data we collected was over 7 days. The average weight loss, eating as much as they could or wanted to eat, was 3.1 pounds. The average drop in cholesterol was 22 points. Again, international units, you divide by 38 to make the conversion. The drop in blood sugars were, tremendous. We've been able to get essentially everybody who has type 2 diabetes off their medications, and their blood sugars end up as good or better in 7 days. And eventually, just by definition, all type 2 diabetics are curable by weight loss and a good diet. So, it wasn't surprising. Anyway, we can read this scientific paper. You can find it on my website, or you could go to PubMed. My website is drmcdougall.com, drmcdougall.com. And there you'll find a plethora of information that, by the way, is all free. People will write me every once in a while and say, I've spent 2 weeks on your website and I'm looking for the gimmick. Where's the gimmick? Well, there are no gimmicks. Mary, my wife, best friend for 46 years, we decided a long time ago that we were going to give this away for free. Well, initially because nobody would buy it, but primarily because we felt our lives were saved by learning. I told you my history before I was 28 years old. I was dying. Mary, my wife and partner, she was a little more moderate her behavior, and she'd probably still done okay. But anyway, we take people, we take about 60 people every month or two into this live-in situation, where we give them a great education. We're also taking care of various employees of companies, employees of various companies. For example, we take care of the employees of Whole Foods markets. And there's a company up here in the Northwest of the US called CenturyLink. I don't know whether you have that telecommunication company there or not, but they send their employees to our program. And the reason they do it is because they see tremendous financial savings for their companies. So anyway, we take care of people in a live-in setting. The information that you need is on the website, including a quick start program, probably 500-600 recipes, discussions of all kinds of topics, from multiple sclerosis to rheumatoid arthritis to type 2 diabetes, and all referenced extremely well, because I have this passion for the scientific literature. So no one has ever come back to me and said, John, you were overly biased. You distorted what the science says. I've been at this for more than 40 years. I've been a physician for more than 50 years. And, to my face, there's never been any criticism. And I've published in some of the major medical journals, and I've spoken to some of the major, professional conferences, and a lot of people don't like what I have to say, but they never deny it to be true. And again, the observation that you all should make, rather than arguing the science, which by the way is paid for by industry these days, is you should just rely upon that observation I told you, and that is throughout all of human history, all large. Remember, the Inuit population was not large. Successful, the Inuit population, don't take this as a criticism, but it was not very advanced. They had a rough, primitive life. All large, successful populations of people, those living in Asia, in South America, North America, lived on a diet where the bulk of the calories had come from starch. It was too hard to get animals, fortunately. But let me just take a side note for you here. Do you want to know why the hunter-gatherer theory has been focused on the hunter? In other words, people use the argument, well, we're all hunter-gatherers, and with the emphasis on the hunter. Well, it's a gender bias thing. It's a male dominance thing. We talked about what the men did. They went out and maybe were gone for 2 weeks, and maybe they got an animal, and maybe they brought it back before it was rotten. But who was collecting the food for the village? It was the grandparents, the children, the women. So the hunter-gatherer theory, as far as almost all, 99.99% of the populations, the exceptions being people living on the extremes of the environment. The hunter-gatherer theory must look at who obtained most of the calories, and it was the women, the grandparents, the kids. The men got the glory, just as they do today. Gender bias.
Yeah. So I want to, I just got 2 more things to talk about, but I think we'll talk a bit more in depth about the diet that you recommend. And as you were saying, when people follow this diet, you say that they should expect the results that you were talking about, like lower blood sugar, lower cholesterol, losing weight. So why is that? And how long, you said about 7 days to get results, and what success have you had with compliance?
Okay, well, this is all published. Our study on compliance was done at Oregon Health and Science University, the medical school in Portland, Oregon. And they studied a group of our patients looking at the effects of our diet on multiple sclerosis. And we found some very positive effects. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough money to really show the kind of effects we wanted to show. But for example, we got significant, tremendous relief of fatigue. The average weight loss, this was a study done, a randomized controlled trial, done completely independent of me, except that I educated the people. They came to my 10-day live-in program. After that, before that, I did not gather the participants. They did. They randomized the participants. They collected the data. They analyzed the data. They published the paper. I had nothing to do with it. But the results were, first of all, they were surprised by compliance. I can remember the day that I walked into my principal investigator's office at the neurology department at Oregon Health and Science University. And she had the biggest smile on her face. She says, "John, I cannot believe this. The compliance rate is huge." They had found that 85% of people remain compliant. And they published this in the scientific paper, never been criticized. 85% of people remain compliant for a year. Why? Because the food tastes good. Why? Because the results were so dramatic. Why? Because it cut their food bill. Why? Because it fit in with their concern for animal rights. Why? Because it fit in with their concern for planetary destruction, global warming. It just felt right to it. So 85% of people complied for a year, independent of any further education on our part. We got an average of 20-pound weight loss that was sustained for a year, an average of 20-point drop in cholesterol, which was sustained for a year, and all kinds of phenomenal benefits that we see every day. So the compliance rates are quite high. And this study, again, is published in the scientific literature. You can look it up. It's in MS and Related Diseases, which is the journal, but just look up my name, multiple sclerosis. And you'll find a scientific study, which, by the way, even though it was published, well, I think it was published in 2015, I might have the date wrong on that. But it's never been criticized. It's changed the subject matter of neurologic conferences worldwide. They're all talking about diet now. And Oregon Health and Science University, they've told me, the professors there in the neurology department, is they want to be known as the dietist center of the world. Because a good diet will stop multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is caused by the Western diet. It's an autoimmune disease. So compliance is high. Benefits are dramatic. It's just like if you quit smoking. Anybody who knows a chronic cigarette smoker knows that they get better in 7 days, almost immediately, just by stopping the poisoning, or an alcoholic. They stop falling down, like within 3 or 4 days after they're stopping the drinking. The problem that people are suffering from in Western societies, which is now, the bulk of the people of the world, the problem people are suffering from is from food poisoning due to animal products and vegetable oils. And, when I initially say that to a lot of folks, they say, well, that's all I eat. Well, that's because you haven't to this point understood that the human being is a starch eater, a starchivore, a starchitarian. And once you get this set in your mind, it really takes people a big step, because the education by the meat and dairy industry and the food industry has been so brainwashing. It's very difficult for people to get their mind wrapped around the idea that they're eating the wrong food. It's just like I was talking to my daughter there. We have company visiting. So I was talking to her about her animals last night. And she was talking about how sick her cats were. And then once they changed the cats to a wet food meat diet, all the cats' condition cleared up. There's a diet for cats. They won't live on baked potatoes. They're carnivores, and that's what they're supposed to eat. Well, there's a diet for human beings too, and that's a starch-based diet with a few fruits and vegetables. Animal foods in the form of animal secretions, which are known as dairy products, or animal flesh or organs or whatever, animal parts that you eat, are not only not necessary, but the body can only tolerate a small amount of them. The body does tolerate them, just like the body will tolerate a little alcohol, a little smoking, but it won't tolerate at the level of consumption that have been traditional for aristocrats of the past. People in Canada, people in Europe, people in now China, and of course the US led the way, they all look like kings and queens. And they, they're helpless, because you're not going to solve the problem by being hungry. You're not going to solve the problem by making yourself sick, which is what you do by going on a diet like the Atkins diet. You become sick, so you lose your appetite. You're not going to follow it you're not going to get well by following a lot of the other gimmicky diets.
I think right now the biggest one here is the keto diet. A lot of people, if you go into the bookstores now, I'd say about a couple months ago, it was all plant-based, vegetarian, and now they've got the keto books right next to the vegan cookbooks as well, and it's just another fad that people are jumping on, but they're excited because they lose weight so quickly.
Well, they do, because they get sick. First they lose a lot of water from the protein, and they lose their glycogen stores, not even carbohydrate. As a result, they lose 6 to 10 pounds in a week of water weight and loss of glycogen, which is the sugar stored in the muscles. And so they get excited, and then if they can maintain it, which they can't. Even Robert Atkins was fat. I did a video, you've probably seen it, on people in our camp who teach a high starch diet, and people in their camp, like Sally Fallon and Lauren Cordain and Barry Sears and Robert Atkins. They're all fat, sick people. I mean, just look at the gurus, and you'll see that you don't want to do what they're doing. You know, I mean, the ones that recommend the low-carb diets, they're fat and sick. I mean, you know, I never predicted it, but I've outlived Atkins. You know, I'm older than he was when he died. And anyway, I know that if I had maintained and continued the diet, had my eyes opened as a plantation doctor, I would have been dead long before Atkins.
Yeah. And so for your diet, could you tell us what the diet is that you recommend and why we shouldn't be concerned about protein, calcium, omega-3s, and vitamin D?
Well, the diet I recommend is a starch-based diet. When you look at your plate, you should see 90% of the food is rice or potatoes or sweet potatoes. You cannot live on above ground storage organs alone, which would be grains and legumes, because they're missing A and C. So you must have a little bit of A and C, which come from fruits and vegetables. You can live on a diet of underground storage organs alone. You can live on a diet of only potatoes and water. That shows you how complete the food is and how simple our needs are. So the diet I recommend is starch-based, and what you, as traditionally people have eaten, almost everybody that's walked the earth. When you look at your plate, you see that about 90% of the food is starch, with maybe 10% being fruits and vegetables. And if you still choose to consume treats, delicacies, status food, I don't know what you want to call it. You're gonna get away with eating some turkey on Thanksgiving and a candy bar on on Halloween and a piece of cake on your birthday. But unfortunately, most of us we start every day with a holiday called Easter, and we go on to another couple holidays every day, like Thanksgiving and Christmas, and we finish every meal with a birthday party. And as a result, we end up fat and sick. So we have almost 4,000 published recipes. You can get probably 500-600 of them on my website, drmcdougall.com, for free. We also have the McDougall mobile cookbook app, which has over 1,000 recipes, which I think is $5. And people love that app. You need to find one or two or three things you like. Every morning, Mary and I have oatmeal because it's easy. She either makes it, or we have a food company called Dr. McDougall's Right Food, which is in over 6,000 stores. Now, I don't know whether it's in your part of the world or not. There's a problem with having food products sold in Canada because they must have French labels on them. You know, so I don't know how our sales have gone up there, but we're in 6,000 stores in the U.S., almost every store. Almost every store that sells groceries are Dr. McDougall's Right Foods. So we'll start out the morning with breakfast with an oatmeal, either that Mary has made or with Dr. McDougall's Right Food oatmeals. And then there are just a few dishes that we really enjoy that we make over and over again. Such as Thai noodles. That's one of my favorites. And it tastes better than any Thai noodles you've ever had. Another favorite of mine, I could probably live on it for 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, is mashed potatoes. I have mashed potatoes with peas or corn, some gravy that Mary makes. And actually, that's has been one of my favorite dishes for my whole life for the past 70 years plus, is mashed potatoes and gravy and some peas and corn. The gravy used to be made from beef stock, and now Mary makes it from a vegetable stock. So you don't have to make a diet of great variety. You can just pick a few things you like, make them over and over again. People are very monotonous in their eating. I mean, think about it. If you go to a restaurant, you order the same thing from that menu at that restaurant every time you go. You have the same thing for breakfast every day. You have 2 or 3 different things for lunch or dinner, even if you're on the American diet. So we have over 4,000 recipes published. You need to find 4 or 5 things you like. And we use a little bit of salt, a little sugar to make them taste better. For most people, there are exceptions who can't use salt, sugar. And people love the food. And they love the results. And they're amazed by the results. And I can tell you how good it makes me feel. And the 7 doctors who work with me, when we take in people, as many as 150 people at a time at our clinics, it's extremely rewarding for our staff. And when you come to the McDougall program in Santa Rosa, California, you'll just see how enthusiastic the staff is, because we have a chance to change people's lives, to make other people's lives better. There's no greater reward than that. Right before our eyes, we see people lose, as I gave you the data on average, but well, I didn't give you the data on medications. So published data shows that we get nearly 90% of people to reduce or stop all of their blood pressure and diabetic medications. That's not bad. You don't want to be a sick person. You don't want to be, you live your life filled with doctor's appointments, trying to remember what pill you have to take at what time of the day. You want your health back. And the way to get your health back is to stop the cause of the illnesses. And the cause of the illnesses in the rich societies is very simple. We eat animal foods, oils, and various other, refined foods and junk. And the way to solve the problem is you stop throwing gasoline on the fire. And people get well, and they get well permanently. If you go to my website, drmcdougall.com, you'll see about 200 Star McDougall stories. These are typical results of people being cured of rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, psoriatic arthritis, stopping very severe heart disease that was destined for bypass surgery or angioplasties. People who, even people who have had cancer, even though we don't advertise as a place that treats cancer. The American Cancer Society, as I told you in February of 2015, told all the doctors in the United States that they ought to have, as part of the fundamental treatment for their patients, a plant food-based diet.
Yeah, I know you have.
So we see benefits with cancer patients also.
Yeah, you have some great testimonials, and with the cancer as well. I think it's Dr. T. Colin Campbell did a study or some studies.
Yeah, Dr. Campbell, of course, is one man on our team.
Yeah.
And very thin, healthy, 85-year-old gentleman. He's been a good friend of mine for almost 30 years.
Yes.
And he's published on diet and cancer and has done some basic research. So, but I have to tell you, my colleagues are slow learners. And this is all based on income. If we change the reward for their treatment to one where we rewarded good health as opposed to just treatment, then everything would change. But even at Oregon Health and Science University, where they saw miraculous changes in people's health, they're still pushing useless drugs that have been proven to not benefit the patients in terms of primary outcomes, like living longer. They benefit secondary things like, well, they're secondary things. They're not what you primarily want to get from your treatments. So the medical journals are quite clear that these drugs that cost, I used to say they cost $75,000 a year, but at a meeting I had with the faculty at OHSU last month, they corrected me, and they say, no, John, now the drugs are $100,000 a year, just for the drugs. Anyway, OHSU had the experience of seeing people cured. Dramatic benefits in their health. The head of the neurology department told me, John, he says, I'd never had a patient come up and thank me for putting them on interferon beta, $100,000 a year drug. He said, but in the last couple of years taking care of your patients, typically I have people come in tears because of the benefits that they've received. from a healthy diet, the weight loss, a chance to play with their children and grandchildren again. The reward has been tremendous. In fact, OHSU is, the neurology department is trying to start a dietary program independent of mine. I don't know whether they'll ever do it because they personally haven't made the commitment. They personally are too busy to take care of even among their own selves, to much less teach the people with MS about a good diet. But our results are there, they're published, they're uncriticized. They're just not profitable.
Right.
That's the problem.
Well, I think the amazing thing is it's so easily, like the knowledge and the research now, like thanks to yourself and other websites like nutritionstudies.org and nutritionfacts.org, people can empower themselves to take their health into their own hands and start like on an individual basis.
Well, people can. And first they have to realize that what's being done for them isn't working.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're getting a bunch of excuses and a handful of pills from your doctor. And you went for good intentions. Your doctor probably approached you with good intentions, but unfortunately he or she does not have tools that make a difference. You know, they change some secondary issues such as your cholesterol level, but they don't prevent heart attacks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, excuse me, statin drugs do prevent heart attacks, but only really sick people. The benefits are minor, whereas a dietary change, it may sound like a big deal to you, but you know, big changes result in big improvements. If you're going to make, you know, if your diet change is to skin your chicken and to eat skim milk instead of whole milk, you're not going to get any real benefits. You must make a major change in your fuel source. And that should be appealing to many of you. You should think about things that you like that are starches, like French toast or pancakes or oatmeal or, you know, grain burgers or spaghetti marinara sauce or mashed potatoes. I mean, things that you already love. And put a little salt, sugar, and spice on them to enhance the flavor. And again, there are some exceptions that people can't use these enhancing ingredients, but most people can. And you'll have to be prepared to get off your medications.
Mm-hmm.
As I say, we stop or reduce nearly 90% of the drugs within 7 days that people have taken for 5, 10, 20 years. And their numbers are better. If they don't stop the blood pressure pills and the diabetic pills, the sugars and blood pressures get so low that they will risk of falling. So anyway, you need to have your eyes open. You need to realize that the medical business, even though it's trying, is an extremely profitable business. And the bottom line is what they're concerned about. That has to do with selling drugs and heart surgeries and building hospitals, etc.
I think one of the biggest changes or reasons for people to look at what they're eating now and getting a lot of attention is climate change and food security. So here, food security is a major issue because we're an island and we get most of the food that people eat these days is imported. So we get a lot of food delivered by boat or by plane. And if there's poor weather, then we don't get deliveries. The ice can block ships from coming in. So it used to be, we had the cod fishery was a big business here. People lived on, but as you know, the fish stocks are so low. Even salmon stocks, they were talking about this summer, they might have to stop salmon fishing because they were threatened. So now there's mussel farms, and they've just started a salmon farm, and there's a push for starting more animal agriculture and aquaculture here on the island. So people are moving as well towards homesteading. Just your average person wants to grow their own vegetables and keep some livestock like chickens and goats for, you know, goat milk and make cheese and turkeys. So what I want to ask you about now is what's the issue with animal agriculture, even if you have it free range and grass fed and it's local, and like for us here, trying to be food secure, is there a different way that we can go?
Well, this is what keeps me going. This is why I get up every morning with optimism. I have 7 grandchildren. As a matter of fact, they're all visiting today. And Mary and I, this is one of our yearly gatherings of our 3 children, their spouses, and our 7 grandchildren. They have no future. They have no future. Up where you are, the global warming in the northern latitudes and southern latitudes. As you get further away from the equator, the effects of global warming are even greater. So you must be seeing tremendous changes. We are seeing them where we live too. As a matter of fact, the reason I live in Portland, Oregon now is because in October 9th, 2017, everything I owned was taken by the wildfires of California. So we're having massive wildfires on the West Coast, massive hurricanes on the East Coast. The polar caps are melting. And the cause, there are many causes, and they're focused on things that need to be changed, like transportation, how to generate energy that is environmentally friendly. But one of the things that's never talked about, and it really isn't, it's just so rare for folks to talk about this, is the impact of the livestock industry. The World Health Organization, in a report that they published in 2006, came to the conclusion that the livestock industry accounts for 18% of the global warming gases, which is more than all of transportation. It's more than any other segment of the economy as far as causing global warming gases. The World Watch Institute reanalyzed their data, and they came to the conclusion that over half the global warming gases were caused by the livestock industry. Now, I have an electric car. Where I live, it is not conducive to solar panels. I would have solar panels, and those are good things, but it'll take 10 to 20 years to show an impact. Whereas food is something that, the 7 billion people on this planet could change overnight if they got enough education from honest physicians and dietitians and politicians and so on about the impact of the livestock industry on our environment, and how your children and your grandchildren are not going to have a place to live. I mean, I hate to say it, but every time I pick up a newspaper, every report I hear talks about a worse outcome than they predicted just a couple of months ago. Things are going so fast. So we need an intervention like a change to a starch-based diet to save the planet. I don't think it's ever going to happen if you want the truth, but consider the fact that the production of beef is 100 times more environmentally destructive than the production of the same number of calories of potatoes. So, if we want to save the world, we've got to do it with dietary change as the immediate step forward. We need to do all these other things in terms of power production and travel and so on. But, even with all that effort, we're not going to do it without fixing the diet, because it's so environmentally unfriendly, livestock. Even the fish farming that you talked about is environmentally terribly unfriendly. People are eating food that's destroying the planet that is poisonous to themselves, to their spouses, to their fathers and mothers, to their children. And it's causing a worldwide epidemic that is highly profitable to the drug industries, the food industries, the hospitals, the doctors, etc. It's all money, folks. It's not a conspiracy. It's just people doing business. And as a consequence, we really have a very little chance of saving planet Earth. But I ain't giving up. And I can tell you're not either. I hope your viewers take at least part of our message and have their eyes opened and start looking into how to save themselves, their families, contribute to their communities, and the world at large. You can combine all of the bad habits that people have, heroin addiction, cigarette smoking, alcoholism, etc. You can combine all of those and look at the cost to individuals, to families, to local communities, to countries, to the planet, and all the cost of all of these bad habits, so to speak, is minuscule compared to the cost of food poisoning that's occurring. I mean, after all, growing tobacco and growing alcohol is environmentally friendly. You know, even growing heroin, it's not like I'm recommending these things. I'm just saying everybody's up in arms about recognized bad habits. Of course, the alcohol tobacco industry don't believe it's true. And they need to focus their attention on the livestock industry. Well, the only I see that we have a chance of saving ourselves.
There's
I think that was a good enough amount of time spent with your viewers.
Yeah.
And I hope they will take your message and contribution that Mary and I have made along with our fellow colleagues and don't hold back. You know, the consequences are too great from being politically correct. So whatever talent you have, you know, whether you're a physicist or a florist or a gardener or you know, whatever your talents are, a lawyer, a doctor, good communicator, you know, go out there and try and open other people's eyes. It's too important. And it's too impossible for just a few of us individuals to make the change. We need everybody's help.
So I just want to say before we close, I'm just going to tell you some of the things that people can grow here, and then you tell me if we can actually be sustainable and thrive on them nutritionally. So here in Newfoundland, in our climate, and it's even greater now with advances in technology for greenhouses and growing for a longer period of time. We've grown potatoes,
yeah,
carrots.
Potatoes will grow almost any place.
Yeah, rutabagas, which we call turnips here, but rutabagas, cabbage, kale. Then of course there's other varieties. So we've got tons of wild berries, blueberries and raspberries everywhere. So just on those things alone, would we be able to, you know, be sustainable and to thrive nutritionally?
Well, yeah. We have a world that has the possibility with the communication we have, you know, the possibility of making changes that will make all the difference. Just, you know, if we could just get the message about the truth about food out to people, we would give us some more time. We need more time. There are a lot of dedicated people out there trying to solve the problems related to fossil fuels. But we're really, you know, you and I and you know, a few other folks out there are really the only ones that are addressing the most easily and quickly changeable and most destructive part of our living, which is the food that we're eating. And so many problems could be solved. You could close 80% of the hospitals. You put the pharmaceutical business, well, you know, there's some drugs that are of some help, but you could tone them down considerably. Anyway, it's the food, folks. It's the food. Go to drmcdougall.com and you'll see the subtitles. It's the food.
I'm going to provide a link to your website on the YouTube page.
Well, look up. You know, I spent 40 years working hard, doing professional lectures, writing books. We have 13 national best-selling books. 6 of them are still in active publication after, some of them after 25 years. They've been such popular books. And we send out bi-weekly mailings of lectures that I've given and events that we're having. For example, we start a program at the end of January, 10-day program that we'll have about 50 to 60 people at, we'll take care of. And I believe in March or May of this year, 2019, we have a weekend, which will be attended by, somewhere between 150 and 300 people. So we have a lot of educational opportunities, all the way from totally free, completely covering the subject on our website. We can't take you totally free on our adventure vacations or keep you at our clinic. But if you want the information, there's nothing held back. It's all there.
I have to say, your website was a huge resource for me. And where I don't really have a lot of money, I devoured everything on your website. The free e-lectures, the interviews with experts, the webinars, like you were saying, the hot topics, the newsletters. It's an incredible wealth of information.
I'm glad you enjoy them, appreciate them. I have doctors who tell me from all over the country that, when they look at a topic, the first thing they do is they go to my website, look what I had to say about it. And then pretty much from there, they can dissect out the truth. The truth is the truth. It doesn't change. It hasn't changed, since the Egyptian pharaohs or Daniel in the Bible or anything you've ever observed. The truth is the same. We can tolerate a little bit of poison. The human being can. That includes tobacco, a little opioid, a little alcohol, but it gets out of hand. You can tolerate a piece of birthday cake on your birthday, but you can't have a birthday party twice a day. And, anyway, has no profit.
Yeah, I'm going to do a bit of a plug for some of your books and then close up. So for people who are interested in some of Dr. McDougall's books, this one I highly recommend, Starch Solution.
Oh, yeah, that's a worldwide national bestseller.
Yeah,
I have to say that's the best book that we've written. But it's kind of interesting. My son, who's a professor at OHSU Medical School here in Portland, he told me as he went through his medical education and he started reading his dad's books. He said, "Dad, you said it all in the McDougall Plan, which I published in the early 80s. Why did you have to write another book?" Well, we got better at communicating over the years. And so as a result, you can start with the McDougall Plan, which was written in the early 80s and became a New York Times bestseller. And you'll get the same message that you get 40 years from them. And people sometimes say to me, "Why do you teach the same thing over and over again? You've been teaching the same thing for 40 years. Well, my mentors used to teach the same thing. And Daniel used to teach the same thing. And, the truth's the truth. I'm not going to change.
If people are interested, this is your latest book.
Yeah, that's Healthiest Diet. That's from Harper One.
What I love about this one is your color picture book, which you can get for free on your website.
Yeah, you can get it in 24 languages.
Yeah, it's a great guide for anybody who's just like, I don't want to think about what I eat, just something simple, and they can flip through that and look at it on your website and get all the information.
They go to my website. The Healthiest Diet on the Planet was it's a color picture book of food poisoning. And it's been a big success. And I strongly recommend it. People usually, like you did, you get both books. And often my Maximum Weight Loss book. And, there are as I say, we've written 13 national best-selling books. But any of them will give you the message, or you can have it perfectly free just by going to the website. No gimmicks. It's all there.
And there's 2 more, and that's it. And just because I find people have a great interest in them. And one is the digestive tumor.
Yeah, that's a fun book.
And
That's my only book you can sit down and read cover to cover about the bowels and enjoy it.
yeah, and I mean that, you know, when it comes down to the food, your first contact with it is your digestive system, and they're finding now that for the microbiome and the food synergy and how your immune system is a lot in the gut and neurotransmitters, it's pretty fascinating. And my other one that I recommend to people, especially when they're concerned about their doctor's advice or registered dietitian or nutritionist, is this one here.
Well, that is a book.
Yeah.
I wrote that probably 35 years ago.
Yeah.
It's about the treatment of osteoporosis and cancer and heart disease.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a thorough review of the scientific literature. And nothing has changed since then.
It's funny, you know, I read that and I saw when it was published, and it's all relevant now.
Oh, yeah. But, you know, the same truths that I published back then are true today.
Mm-hmm.
Even though back then the drug companies didn't own the journals and the doctors as much as they do today. But McDougall's Medicine of Challenge and Second Opinion is a classic. Mm-hmm. So anybody interested in the failure of current medical practices to solve the chronic disease problems, the basic scientific literature is all there. You'll find nothing to contradict it. And then you'll see the dietary approach that's been used by people like Royce Swank and Walter Kempner, who is the sustaining life of Duke University for, 70 years. His program was there. 2 decades, Kempner's work, which is based on a rice diet, supported Duke University. Mm-hmm. So you'll find all of this information on pioneers whose shoulders I stand on, who use diet to treat chronic illnesses like coronary artery disease and chest pain and high blood pressure and type 2 diabetes. This research is so solid and it's been going on for so long, thousands of years. It's just not profitable.
No.
I'm sorry. It's just money.
Yeah. Well, hopefully people will realize that the most sustainable thing they could do is to look after their health, and when they do that, they look after everything else. So.
There's every reason to do the right thing.
Yeah.
So I appreciate the fact that you're out there trying to get friends and family and relatives changing. You know, this is a war. We have to win. So, and I'm not going to do it alone, nor is Dr. Campbell or Jean Ornish. And by the way, we do webinars every Thursday, which are done live. The next webinar I'm doing is with Dean Ornish, his wife. So you can watch live presentations, which are also posted. There are probably 250 webinars up on the website I've done, which are free. Mm-hmm. Many lectures from prominent medical doctors and dietitians who agree with me on many issues, but not all issues.
Right.
Yeah. But, you know, I continue to have this belief that I'm right in most things. I hope I'm open-minded enough to critically evaluate, you know, the message I try and give people. Mm-hmm. You look, you see, you judge for yourself. It's all free. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and thank you for your time. And people in Newfoundland love to say that everybody is welcome to visit. So you and your family come to Newfoundland anytime you like, and happy New Year.
Well, you know, there's actually a physician up in your area that practices, uses our methods. I'm sorry, I don't recall his name right at the moment. But, you know, there are doctors around the world who are trying to take care of patients by doing the right thing, which is stopping the cause of their illness, which is the food. It's the food, folks. You need some sunshine, you need to walk around, but it's the food. So thank you very much for a chance to talk to your following.
Yeah, so thank you for coming on to talk to us.
Well, I hope we get a chance to do it again.
Yeah,
soon.
absolutely.
Thank you. Bye-bye.